everyone. So we're going to make a start this afternoon. It's really wonderful to see so many familiar faces in the audience today. My name is Sophie and I'm an MA Curating student here at the Courtauld Institute. Over the last few months, the student cohort has been tasked with curating art exhibitions accompanying public programmes at various venues around London. With a team of 10 other students, under the mentorship of our supervisor Anne Coxon, we have curated Paper Castle, a contemporary art exhibition set within Horace Walpole's Gothic Revival villa, Strawberry Hill House. Our exhibition is entering its final few days, so please visit if you are able to before it closes on the 21st. Our exhibition explores themes of artifice, visual deception, and ghostiness. Artworks are positioned in a trail throughout the house, interacting within specific contexts and frames, which the unique interior decoration provides. We aimed to emphasise the existing trompe-l'oeil elements within the house and honour Walpole's eclectic tastes, sense of camp, playfulness, and his love of all things Gothic. Which brings us to today. Substance and Surface at Strawberry Hill. This symposium conference is the final event in our public programme, in tandem with the exhibition. I, along with my colleague Freddie, have arranged a schedule for this afternoon, and we hope you're all as excited as we are. Over the course of this afternoon, we will hear a range of perspectives regarding the heritage and legacy of Walpole's villa. We have represented this afternoon academic, curatorial, and creative voices that we hope will each offer a new angle or insight to explore the tension between substance and surface. I will briefly attempt to summarise or contextualise Walpole for those who may not have seen the show or who may be unfamiliar. So Horace Walpole was an 18th century tastemaker and socialite, and the son of the first Prime Minister, Robert Walpole. Walpole was not just the designer of Strawberry Hill House, but is widely considered as a pioneer of the Gothic Revival movement in Great Britain. Walpole lived in a time where the prevailing architectural style was austere, refined, and neoclassical. But with Strawberry Hill, he railed against convention in the asymmetry, piecemeal construction, and the collage of Gothic references. He also wrote extensively, and in 1764, he published the Gothic novel, The Castle of Otranto. Alongside his friends, his so-called Committee of Taste, he was instrumental in shaping what we recognise as Gothic themes today. You may imagine a haunted house, ghostly apparitions, and labyrinthine corridors. Strawberry Hill House is constructed of so-called sham materials. For example, the long gallery is a beautiful fan-vaulted ceiling, has been inspired by exemplar Gothic cathedrals from medieval France and Britain. It may look like it's of solid stone, but it's actually paper mache, hence our title, Paper Castle. It is in this context of Walpole and Strawberry Hill House, where theatrical plaster mimics stone, where we are perfectly situated to question the boundary between reality and artifice. So while I have everyone's attention, I'd also like to take this opportunity for some thank yous. So first and foremost to the Research Forum team, Diego, Leila and Grace, to name just a few, for their logistical support for convening today. I'd also like to thank Rosie, Sarah, Philippa and Sylvia from Strawberry Hill for making our exhibition possible, and of course to our supervisor Anne, who's been an excellent mentor. I also have the rather glamorous duty of some housekeeping. So today is being recorded, so you want to keep that in mind when asking any questions. We have a refreshment break scheduled and a drinks reception. This will take place in the seminar room just down the corridor. It'll be fairly obvious, I hope, and you're welcome to join us there. We also have booked Seminar Room 4, located to the left of the lecture theatre, which is booked as a breakout space if you need to take a break at any time. There are bathrooms on every floor of the building. There is no scheduled fire drill for today, therefore if you hear the alarm, please exit down the stairwell and gather in front of the building. We also have a hearing loop available in Lecture Theatre 2. So, returning to the order of play for this afternoon. It will go as follows. There will be 2 sessions and then a panel. The sessions will be roughly an hour long or so, divided into 3 segments of 20 minutes. Each talk will be approximately 20 minutes or so long, and we'll take 1 or 2 audience questions. I ask that your questions be succinct and since we have limited time today. A microphone will come round and find you if you put your hand up to ask these questions. I have to update the schedule. Unfortunately, Martin Myrone, our first speaker, could not make it today, so we have a slightly revised schedule. For session 1, we will have Dr. James Leslie, followed by Dr. Rebecca Trott, and Rebecca Lyons. Then we'll have a break with some refreshments, and we'll come back for session 2 and hear from Cleanthes Kyriakou and Professor Roger Lockhurst, and go directly into our poetry reading from Rupalati Frupa. We will then have a shorter break and reconvene before the panel that will conclude the day, before the drinks reception. With that being said, I think I'd better introduce our first 3 speakers. Up first will be James Leslie, a lecturer of literature at St Mary's, just a stone's throw away from Strawberry Hill House. James visited us at the show the other day, and I'm looking forward to hearing more on what he described as the inherent instability of the Gothic genre. Next, we'll have Dr. Rebecca Trott, who currently works as an archivist in London, but more importantly, before that, she supervised me at undergrad. She specialises on the picturesque landscape, and Rebecca will be discussing illumination and gloom at Strawberry Hill. And to round off our first session is Rebecca Lyon, who, in addition to the schedule, will close this session. Rebecca is the director of Pitt's Hanging Gallery and will speak more to the challenges and opportunities of curating a contemporary art in a heritage site. I hope you enjoy session 1. So we welcome James to the podium.
Thank you, Sophie, and for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and discuss one of my favourite places that I happen to be very lucky to work near. I'm going to begin by declaring a deception on my part. The title of this paper, or at least the quote, refers to the Thomas Chatterton scandal in which Walpole was involved. It's going to be kind of briefly linked to, rather than the subject of this topic. As I visited the exhibition and spoke to Freddie, it seemed like a more kind of introductory discussion about the literary and architectural work that Walpole did is more suitable. So we'll see if we have time for Chatterton at the end, and I'll leave you to decide whether a misleading appearance invalidates the substance of what I'm about to say. So I'll start with Walpole's letter to Lady Ossory, which gives the title to our exhibition, where he says, "I am no poet, my castle is of paper. My castle and my attachment and I shall soon vanish and be forgotten." This comment highlights the interconnected nature of his textual and material practices, which, as Emily M. West writes, collaborate to produce the Gothic genre and its effects. Strawberry Hill is both a setting and, in some ways, a character in Walpole's Gothic novel, The Castle of Otranto, and he later documented the house and its collections in a description of the villa of Horace Walpole, 1784, a text which Walpole and his coterie elaborated through extra illustration, which, as Louisa Calais and Freya Gowley have shown, turns the house into a book and reciprocally the book into a house. More recently, the description was a key source in the house's recomposition through restoration between 2006 and 2010. So the slippage between Gothic texts and Gothic spaces, and the tension between fact and fabrication raised by Walpole's performances within these forms, continue to shape our encounters with the house and its Gothic legacies. This paper is going to discuss the theme of deception in Walpole's works, not in the hope of separating truth from fiction, or to use their 18th century analogues, history and romance, but rather to consider how his attention to the frequently blurred boundaries between these two seemingly oppositional terms can generate insights into the development of the 18th century Gothic and the ways we engage with its legacy through exhibitions like Paper Castle. So Walpole identified both Strawberry Hill and the novel he wrote there as Gothic works, a style whose character and effects he distinguished, as Sophie said, from the neoclassical style prominent at the time. The Grecian aesthetic modelled at Chiswick House, which he compares Strawberry Hill to here, is, at least to this literary scholar's eyes, ordered, symmetrical, stable, and legible. Strawberry Hill is often irregular, and to borrow terms from my fellow speakers, labyrinthine and gloomy. The hallway, lit by a single lantern and decorated in grey wallpaper that mimics stone, is dark and claustrophobic. Its lugubrious atmosphere is continued in other parts of the house, such as the trunk corridor on the first floor, and then is dramatically lifted in rooms like the magnificent red and gold gallery, which Sophie mentioned, made out of papier-mâché. These spaces provoke a visceral response generated by obfuscation, uncertainty, and dynamic opposition, rather than the type of rational balance methods which underpinned Enlightenment empiricist philosophy and standards of taste. As Matthew Reeve has described, Walpole viewed the Gothic as a vehicle of self-expression, which allowed imaginative liberty and freedom from oppressive aesthetic norms that defined modernity itself. In his Anecdotes of Painting in England, published in 1762, Walpole aligned this license with the Gothic's capacity to generate meaning through the passions, rather than the systematic principles inherent in neoclassical hierarchies of aesthetic value. And so one must have taste to be sensible of the beauties of Grecian architecture. One only wants passions to feel Gothic. Walpole located this aesthetic in ancient buildings, those dismissed by our ancestors who revived the Grecian taste, as he wrote, during the Renaissance. And he characterized these Gothic churches and convents as spaces that furnish one with ideas and visions and romantic dreams. Walpole's Gothic allowed experimentation with alternate identities, along with hybridization and juxtaposition of diverse materials, which, as Emily West again says of the lantern in the hallway, remake normative models of temporality and sexuality by gathering together fragments here of stained glass and family crests and assembling them together. This lantern, West argued, explodes orthodox historical narratives which focus on singular points of origin and inheritance to establish legitimate lines of dynastic glory. For Walpole, the focus on inception points belies the multiplicity of global history and constructs the past according to the principles and prejudices of the modern historian. If, he argues, we were able to locate the first hovel that was ever built, and from that patriarch hut we should possess a faithful genealogy of all its descendants, then this curiosity would destroy much greater treasures. It would annihilate fables, researches, conjectures, hypotheses, disputes, blunders, and dissertation, that library of human impertinence. The treasures that emerge from historical discourse are not single objective truths, but a library of speculation and fabulation, which Walpole would soon expand with the publication of the Castle of Otranto in 1764. The title page of the first edition of Otranto outlines a multi-layered history of the text, which its alleged translator, William Marshall, elaborates further in a preface which frames the novel's main narrative. Their discovery of the manuscript in a library of an ancient Catholic family in the north of England initiates an enigmatic compositional history which invites further speculation on the part of the reader. It also aligns the manuscript with the remote northern geographies implicated in recent antiquarian controversies, like James McPherson's alleged translation of the Ossian poems. which presented supposedly ancient works whose authenticity was fiercely contested for the remainder of Walpole's lifetime, following their initial publication in 1760. Alongside these enticements to antiquarian investigation, the preface mimics the progressive trajectories of Enlightenment histories, which would associate its remote chronological and geographical origins with the miracles, visions, necromancy, dreams, and other preternatural events that it describes, which Marshall asserts are exploded now even from romances. The irony here, of course, when we read on, is that these pseudo-scientific claims about cultural progression from past to present are reflexively subverted by the very contents of the story that follows. So the parodic commingling of evidence and fabrication is compounded at the end of the preface with Marshall's offer to reprint the original Italian, should the first edition prove a success. This gesture emulates the process of verification that skeptics like Samuel Johnson, and indeed Walpole himself, called for in relation to the Ossian poems, whilst implying that the fixation on evidence might venerate materials whose constitution and contents, as Otranto's miraculous narrative shows, may be just as fantastical and fabulous as any vision set down during those allegedly dark ages. Yet while it satirizes both contemporary antiquarianism and historical methodologies, the preface also offers a testament to the allure of the mysterious and elusive artifact, when it concludes urging the reader that the groundwork of the story is founded on truth and the scene is undoubtedly laid in some real castle. We might acknowledge the claim as both evidently true and false, depending on our perspective. The novel's location is real, at least in part, is Strawberry Hill, which Walpole himself playfully referred to as his little Gothic castle. But it's also not a medieval castle. And this ambiguity, if you haven't seen it, is brilliantly expanded in Jan Svankmeyer's 1979 short film, which adapts the novel into a collage of documentary live action and fabulous stop motion. Furthermore and elsewhere, the preface's claim for the authenticity of the dubious materials contained in the subsequent narrative presents a deceptive motif that will recur in Gothic productions from the 18th century to the present day. Works like Carmilla and Dracula, the Blair Witch Project, and Backrooms, which the original YouTube short, the first one is subtitled Found Footage. When the first edition of Otranto quickly sold out, Walpole produced a second with a different title page and preface the following year, 1765. These new paratexts expose the first edition's frame narrative as a fiction, a revelation that led a number of Walpole's contemporaries, including his friends and supporters, to include him in a list of 18th century forgers. And there are letters to him saying, you've got to be kidding, this can't be something that, you can't have written this, it's too weird. The second preface develops Walpole's argument for imaginative liberty as a means of identifying with people in situations which, in their material circumstances, might seem absurd or unimaginable to a modern audience. His avowal for the productive capability of allegedly illegitimate combinations, he talks here about combining the buffoonery and solemnity that's found in Shakespeare's plays, which contemporaries like Voltaire objected to. But also he talks about combining ancient and modern romance through the emotional realism of contemporary novels and the miraculous events of medieval tales. And this connects with the processes of collaboration, hybridization, and juxtaposition incorporated at Strawberry Hill, where the single lantern creates gloom whilst also casting refracted light on a suit of armour, and the rescaled details from choir screens and tombs create the scenes for visions like the Castle of Otranto. And the novel then extends these uncanny assemblages in a narrative whose disorientating syntax and contorted plot animate these Gothic objects and spaces as they move and morph, destabilizing the claims to authority made by the castle's ruler, Manfred. The polymorphous nature of Walpole's work prompted suspicion and disdain from both contemporaries and successors, who, as Reeve has demonstrated, saw his liberal approach to material and narrative multiplicity as deceitful, a facade which attempted to mask more serious deviations from normative taste. Contemporary reviews, and here there's two reviews here. This is of the first edition, which is slightly different from the same publication's review of the second. Here, the Gothic is allowed its absurdity, but its capacity to entertain. However, and I think it's the same reviewer, when they realize they've been duped by the apparatus around the text, they're rather more angry. They criticize the monstrous fictions disseminated by the novel, and these remarks link to contemporary commentators who lamented the splendid impertinence, the tasteless profusion, and the monstrous enormities of suburban villas like Strawberry Hill. These reductive attacks on Walpole and his work continued into the 19th century, when the politician and statesman Thomas Babington Macaulay attacked his grotesque house with pie-crust battlements as a manifestation of a diseased and disorganized mind. And Augustus Pugin, whose design for the Palace of Westminster is perhaps one of the most famous examples of 19th century Gothic Revival architecture, thought Strawberry Hill disgusting, and at times self-consciously positioned himself against Walpole. These criticisms articulate the ways in which Walpole's production continued to disturb normative conceptions of individual and political identity. Macaulay is a historian and politician in the business of empire. Pugin is building the site of government. These illegitimate materials need to be kind of expunged from these type of spaces. But this legacy has been fruitfully extended by recent scholarship, which highlights the multiple ways in which Walpole's works and the Gothic genre that they produce explode reductive literary, aesthetic, and philosophical and architectural history. Nonetheless, while Walpole's comments on the fabricated nature of both his literary and architectural productions reads as a provocative acknowledgement or even an embracing of transience and the resistance to the curation of an orthodox legacy, it is also important to keep in mind his own capacity to contradict. And at times, teaching Walpole, sometimes this relativism or the pluralism encoded in a statement like history is in general is a romance that is believed, and that romance is a history that is not believed, has tempted me to the point of aporia, where I've kind of found myself claiming him as both a sort of post-truth libertarian and a postmodern iconoclast. And that's where I come back to Chatterton, whom he mentions in the same letter that gives this exhibition its title, referring to a grave controversy which has recently found him reluctantly writing again for the public, this in 1778, to defend his reputation by clarifying his role in one of the most famous cases of literary deception of the 18th century. Walpole's response to the accusations against him in relation to the death of Thomas Chatterton was published at Strawberry Hill in 1779 and then was more widely circulated in 1782. And they show that he was concerned with his public reputation and was willing to assert his own judgment and probity in relation to contemporary debates about literary deception. Here he appeals to evidence to correct the public narrative which defamed him as Chatterton's assassin because he'd passed up the opportunity to publish his works back in 1769, 1770. Here Walpole variously shifts between the positions of artist and antiquarian in ways that might appear paradoxical, but remind us again of the shifting conceptualizations of authorial, aesthetic, and historical integrity, which continue to generate insights into the development of the 18th century Gothic and the ways we engage with and maintain its legacies. It prompts further consideration of how we balance the conception of Walpole's irreverent and fantastical Gothic aesthetics as what Strawberry Hill's director David Gamester recently dubbed a creative technology which enables continual imaginative reinterpretations of its meanings, with an acknowledgement of the ways in which his work's creative and critical innovations and the wider body of Gothic culture produced in the 18th century and since gain complexity by being historically situated to resonate more fully with the tensions and ambiguities of its authors and context. As your exhibition shows, artistic practice is a powerful and effective way of engaging with the past. And this relationship is itself reciprocal, as researching the past can also produce contemporary performances which help us to recognize how the legacies of historical, socio-political and cultural crises both shape and can be reimagined by our contemporary practices. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My initial reaction was just, it is so different to hear a literature scholar talk and the way their visuals work. I was like, I think I have a little more color, because that's just what I've been taught, that we need color because we like picture books in art history. Okay, well, you've just been talking about the Gothic and how it wasn't just a British phenomenon, but Strawberry Hill is most immediately associated with the Gothic Revival in Britain, often being credited as the starting point of the intellectual and aesthetic movement that extended through the end of the 18th and across the 19th centuries. Some scholars have argued the caveat that Gothic Revival must be acknowledged alongside Gothic Survival, that the style had never fully died out and instead had appeared in different forms and guises across the centuries. However, my interest in Strawberry Hill lies less in its style than in its relation to the picturesque, a term and a movement that have dominated my research for many years. When scholars talk about the picturesque, it is most often in the context of gardens, or when in relation to country houses, about the external style of the building within those landscapes, generally asymmetrical edifices that appear to have been added to over time and which seem grounded within their visually curated landscapes, as opposed to being raised above and dominating their surroundings. In general, these houses display a broad eclecticism of style, an embracing of asymmetry, an arrangement of parts and placement of apertures that emphasize the framing of views, and an experience that is predicated on a moving spectator. While any architectural style can suit the picturesque, the Gothic is one to which architects often turned, with its rough textures, varying roof lines, and the semblance of accretions having been made over time. The discussion often stops there, at the appearance of the garden and the appearance of the building within it. Less attention has been paid to the three-dimensional repercussions of the picturesque movement on the design and execution of the building to produce this external appearance, or how those same picturesque imperatives manifest once one steps inside the building, how it changes one's experience of the interior. My work generally focuses on the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th centuries, between about 1790 and 1815, when the picturesque was theorized and codified by landscape architect Humphrey Repton and Herefordshire squires Richard Payne Knight and Sir Eubidal Price. But the picturesque had been developing through much of the 18th century and encompassed a broad collection of concepts and techniques which shifted over time. The term picturesque was first introduced by William Gilpin in 1768 in his anonymous An Essay upon Prints. His authorship was revealed in the third edition of 1781. While there are many angles from which one could discuss how the picturesque affected the lived experience of moving around and through buildings constructed in the 18th century, I'm going to focus today on two intertwined issues, both centered on windows and light. They are issues that I have investigated in relation to houses built at the end of the 18th century, but which we also see at Strawberry Hill. The picturesque had not yet been heavily theorized when Horace Walpole began rebuilding Strawberry Hill in 1749, and it was still a relatively loose term when he finished around 1776. But these developing ideas are certainly present in the house and how it engages with its landscape. Before I get into what those two issues are, we might start by asking what constitutes a Gothic window, at least in the context of the Gothic Revival in British domestic architecture. What does a window need to signal to us that it is Gothic? Is it the shape, the pointed arch? Should it include painted or stained glass? What about tracery? If the window can be opened, must it be a hinged casement, or can it take the form of a sliding sash? Or is it more the associated feelings we have in buildings with some or all of these attributes that make it Gothic? The sense of gloom, the famous portmanteau coined by Walpole to convey simultaneous gloom and warmth. In attempting to achieve the sense of Gothic, how do we reconcile utilizing this arsenal of specific features, shape, glass color, mechanics of opening, etc., with the fact that these windows are being installed in a home, where one might desire more natural light and views of the outside, both of which are not necessary, or might indeed be considered anathema, in a building such as a church, from which so many Gothic Revival buildings took their inspiration. With these questions in mind, the first issue I would like to talk about is the balance struck between utilizing painted or stained glass to cast a Gothic gloom over interiors versus using clear glass to provide for the best views, which was of course also central to the picturesque aesthetic. The second issue is the intentional use of contrasting lighting within interiors for emotional and experiential effect. These were choreographed contrasts of illumination between entrance halls or corridors and the polite rooms of the house so as to guide the eye and body through these lived spaces. In Humphrey Repton's 1803 Observations on the Theory and Practice of Landscape Gardening, he noted that, quote, views from a window were of little consequence at a time when glass was hardly transparent, and in many of the ancient castles, the small lozenge panes were glazed with colored glass or painted with the armorial bearings, which admitted light without any prospect. In his own time, however, with improvements in the size and quality of glass panes, framed views became of central importance. If we think of Gothic architecture in the Middle Ages, the vast majority of windows were unglazed, simply being closed by wooden shutters, oiled cloth, paper, or thin sheets of horn, or if in a higher status building, were glazed with small panes of cylinder or crown glass. By the 18th century, there had been vast improvements in the production of glass, minimizing impurities that had previously resulted in bubbles or cloudiness and the green, yellow, or brown tint that one sees in medieval glass. With these advancements in glassmaking technology, panes of cylinder or crown glass could be made larger, and by Repton's time, the higher status buildings increasingly used plate glass, which could be larger still, essentially limited in size only by prohibitive costs rather than technological limitations. In Repton's final book of 1816, he wrote, quote, there is no subject connected with landscape gardening of more importance or less attended to than the window through which the landscape is seen. When rebuilding his house decades earlier, Walpole evidently also placed great store by the views out to the landscape, both in terms of how he sited the house and in his use of strategically placed windows. In a letter to Sir Horace Mann dated 12th June 1753, Walpole wrote, in the tower beyond the blue bedchamber is the charming closet where I am now writing to you. It has two windows. The one in the drawing looks to the garden, the other to the beautiful prospect, and the top of each glutted with the richest painted glass of the arms of England, crimson roses, and 20 other pieces of green, purple, and historic bits. I must tell you, by the way, that the castle, when finished, will have 32 windows enriched with painted glass. Walpole likewise described how the breakfast room had a, quote, bow window commanding the prospect and gloomed with limes that shade half each window, already darkened with painted glass in chiaroscuro, set in deep blue glass. Note in this description that Walpole emphasizes what you can see from a given window, but also tells us that these windows contain painted glass. How did he go about achieving both? Walpole does what other architects I have studied did in the succeeding decades. In order to strike a balance between including colored or painted glass to cast that Gothic gloom over interiors, and using clear glass to provide for the best views, architects often put colored glass solely in the upper lights of windows with clear glass below. With this configuration, one could experience that sense of a Gothic window. The lighting would be somewhat altered, and one would see these jewel-like tones, but at the same time enjoy unhindered views of the carefully framed landscape in those lower windows. And we see this throughout Strawberry Hill. So for those of you who haven't been there, I'm going to illustrate various parts of it. So just taking just a few examples, in the ground floor great parlor, we see that the majority of the window consists of panes of clear glass, but with various small panes of colored glass at the top. Walpole described the window as having, quote, some fine painted glass and one ridiculous Dutch piece representing the triumph of fame, who is accompanied by Cato, Cicero, and other great men in square caps and gowns of masters of arts. Walpole had amassed an impressive collection of over 450 pieces of painted glass, primarily Netherlandish roundels dating to the 16th and 17th centuries, but also fragments of heraldic or armorial stained glass that he would ask friends to seek out and secure for him, or that he commissioned and had made himself. And he incorporated much of this colored glass into his house. As he put it to Sir Horace Mann in a letter about 6 weeks prior to the previous one I quoted, on 27th April 1753, quote, I have amassed such quantities of painted glass that every window in my castle will be illuminated with it. The adjusting and disposing it is vast amusement. Some of these painted glass panels were removed from the house following the Great Sale of 1842. Some remaining pieces were moved around and additions made as part of the repairs and renewals made to the house in the second half of the 19th century, and war damage resulted in further minor losses. However, there were sufficient surviving records to allow for the glass throughout the house to be restored in the early 21st century to the arrangements that Walpole had intended, so one can now see it essentially as it would have been in his time. So if we go upstairs, there are various rooms where we see the same layout of clear glass below and painted glass above, such as in the library, which was also part of the first phase of Walpole's rebuilding, completed in 1754. The gallery formed the centerpiece of the second phase of building and was finished in 1763. And finally, we might look at the Great North Bedchamber, conceived in 1770 and completed in 1773. The state bedroom of the house, this room was meant for display rather than actual use. Even without artificial illumination, you can see how light streams in through these windows with pops of color reflecting on the wall or floor. There are additional rooms where we see similar windows, such as in the blue breakfast room, the blue bedchamber, and the Holbein chamber, but you get the idea. If we fast forward to the end of the 18th century, we see similar uses of colored glass in upper panes with clear glass below, at, for example, John Nash's Luscombe Castle in Devon, and in James Wyatt's non-extant Fonthill Abbey in Wiltshire. Let's stay on Luscombe Castle for a moment, which I studied during my master's and PhD. During that time, I came across descriptions in pattern books that seemed as if they were specifically describing Luscombe, but which were evidently describing a much broader design idea. Pattern books were generally not trendsetters, since most of these writers did not become successful architects, but they did reflect existing trends. John Buonarroti Papworth, for example, described a design for a cottage ornée adapted to romantic scenery in his 1818 pattern book, Rural Residences, which reads very similarly to what one encounters in Nash's houses. Papworth writes, quote, the interior of the cottage represented in the engraving admits of a very interesting style of decoration. And then he continues, describing how the window of the little hall of entrance, quote, being small, would subdue the light so as to give it a calm effect and afford that repose to the eye which is always agreeable after a long exposure to the greater quantity abroad. And this is also desirable as it prepares it to receive with greater force the cheerfulness or the brilliancy of the best apartments. Very desirable oppositions are to be obtained by a proper arrangement of light in halls, vestibules, and corridors. For the finest apartments gain very much of the favorableness of first impressions by the balance in their favor, which, in light and color, the former are prepared to yield to them. Repton, too, had earlier written about utilizing contrasts in lighting. In his 1803 observations, describing his plan for Bayham, he noted, quote, the hall and passages should be rather dimly lighted by painted glass, to impress a degree of gloom essential to grandeur, and to render the entrance into the rooms more brilliant and cheerful. Essentially, these writers were arguing that one should design entrance halls and corridors of houses to be relatively dim, often lit solely by a small window filled with colored glass, so that one's eyes could adjust from the comparative brightness of being outside. The polite rooms leading off from this entrance hall or corridor would then be comparatively well lit, illuminated by large windows consisting mostly of clear panes, making these rooms seem even brighter and cheerier when contrasted with what preceded them, drawing one forward and guiding one's movement through these interior spaces. Looking at Luscombe specifically, one enters into a relatively dark entrance hall with stained glass in the entrance door and a small window off to one's left, before proceeding into an inner hall that leads off to the eating room on the left, drawing room straight ahead with attached veranda cum conservatory, and staircase off to the right. Each of these rooms is lit by large windows filled predominantly with clear glass. What is important here is that these writers were suggesting, and architects were building, a much more nuanced approach to natural lighting than simply maximizing illumination throughout the house for those who could afford it. They were promoting a picturesque experience of contrasting light and shadow within buildings, paralleling what one would experience throughout the gardens. If we return to Strawberry Hill, one cannot help but be struck by the contrasts of lighting within the house, which are likewise emphasized in watercolors of the period. Probably the most famous image of the house is this one of the staircase, where we see dramatic contrast of light and shadow. But how is gloom, this striking contrast of dark, spooky corners and bright shafts of light, actually achieved? As you can see, the windows on the ground floor of the entrance hall were entirely filled with colored glass, which Walpole writes about in his descriptions of the house, but also on a folded sheet preserved at the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, in which he describes the aesthetic effects at Strawberry Hill. In the former publication, he writes, quote, "You first enter a small, gloomy hall paved with hexagon tiles and lighted by two narrow windows of painted glass." He goes on to explain that there's also a, quote, "Gothic lantern of tin japanned hanging in the center of the staircase, which is, quote, filled with painted glass." But it is not simply a matter of darkness or gloominess, but its contrast with brighter illumination. Walpole explains this trick, and more generally how he had approached contrast and lighting throughout the house in the Fitzwilliam Museum document. He begins, "Great effects may be produced by the disposition of a house, and by studying lights and shades, and by attending to a harmony of colors. I have practiced all these rules in my house at Strawberry Hill, and have observed the impressions made in spectators by these arts. With regard to lights and shades, the first entrance strikes by the gloom. The staircase opens upwards to greater light. As you can see, though dark below through the use of small windows filled with stained glass, the staircase is lit from above by 4 roof lights filled with clear glass. So you enter into this space that is the epitome of gloom, but with this mysterious ethereal light pouring down from above. And Walpole doesn't just do this in the entrance hall. There are corridors and various generally smaller rooms with windows that are entirely composed of colored panes, which one passes through en route to larger rooms containing windows of clear panes below and colored above, creating this sense of contraction and expansion. Upstairs, for example, he describes how, quote, "The star chamber and dusky passage again prepare you for solemnity. The Holbein chamber softens that idea, yet still maintains a grave tone, for the whole coloring is a kind of chiaroscuro." Although Walpole later altered what we see in this watercolor, we are approaching here from the star chamber, and in front of us on the left of the image, we see a stained glass window contributing to the dimness of the corridor. As we pass through the door on the right into the Holbein room, we move into a screened entrance space and then into the comparatively brighter bayed space beyond, which is lit by 3 windows which, you might guess, have clear panes below and colored above. Walpole later punched through where the stained glass window was in the corridor, making it into a doorway leading to the great north bedchamber. Of the great north bedchamber, again supporting my earlier point about using colored glass above and clear panes below, Walpole writes how, quote, "The tops of the windows are adorned with painted glass, while the great size of the rest of the window, which is of plate glass, and the uncommon cheerfulness of the views make the outside as beautiful as the inside." Again, this cheerfulness and those views are heightened through their contrast to what one finds in neighboring spaces. That same dusky passage we were in outside the Holbein room also, quote, "makes the richness and largeness of the gallery appear much more considerable." And then through a doorway near the far end of the gallery, one can enter the tribune, also referred to as the chapel, which Walpole notes for its, quote, true air of a place of devotion. Though Sir John Soane would later become the architect best known for utilizing yellow light in his interiors, Walpole explains in his descriptions how the tribune ceiling is, quote, terminated by a star of yellow glass that throws a golden gloom all over the room, and with the painted windows gives it the solemn air of a rich chapel. Walpole is emphasizing these differences in color and illumination levels, noting in the Fitzwilliam Museum document the, quote, striking contrast between the awe impressed by the chapel, or tribune, and, if we circle back to the great north bedchamber, the gush of light, gaudiness, and grandeur of that latter room. Paired with how one arranges and frames paintings and furnishings, which Walpole also describes, we achieve this ebb and flow of darkness and illumination, of contraction and expansion, all of which will characterize picturesque houses through the end of the 18th century. And Walpole sums it up well near the end of the Fitzwilliam Museum document, quote, I do not mention my own house, which is a small one, but by comparison, and as a sample of what might be done on a magnificent scale, if perspective, the effects of light and shade, harmony in the coloring of the furniture, and a picturesque taste were observed in the whole. Strawberry Hill House, if you've been there, if you haven't been there, it is a playful and amusing and undeniably important building to the history of the Gothic Revival in Britain. But as I have briefly highlighted today, it is also an experiment in picturesque interior design predicated on the use of contrasting levels and colors of illumination, both encouraging and relying upon a moving spectator.
Lovely. Thank you very much for having me. I feel like I am now interrupting academic reverie with a presentation very much about the practicalities and some of the thought processes involved in putting or curating contemporary art within the context of a heritage house. I've been the director of Pitzhanger Manor for about 9 months now, so I'm still relatively new, but very quickly looking at some of the ways that the heritage house can provide a very interesting curatorial environment. It's something that I've noted. One of the first things that I did upon taking up the role was to invite lots of artists that I'd like to work with to come and have a walk around with me, and really sensing their appreciation, their feelings, their instincts about what they're looking at. Now, in a moment or two, I'll explain to you why someone who, if I had to pick a period of scholarship, would have been viewed by peers as a late 18th, early 19th century kind of specialist. So of course there was that instant sense that, oh, right, so you'll be putting Soane back to Pitzhanger, and why in lots of logistical and also creative and I think curatorial ways, that isn't really something that is going to happen. So I want to take you a little bit on the journey that I've been on in thinking about this space. And obviously you'll see from lots of the interiors here, lovely kind of resonances, I think, with some of what Rebecca was talking about there. Obviously the master of light, in terms of how light actually becomes a kind of part of architectural design and interior design as well. But I think perhaps for those who are wholly immersed in Walpole, I'll give you a little intro to Soane, and then I'll talk a little bit more about the programme there. So, Pitzhanger Manor and Gallery belonged to the great British architect Sir John Soane for about a decade. He bought it in 1800 and he sold it again in 1810. It's now located, well, it's always been located in Ealing. Why I say now is that with the advent of the Elizabeth line, I feel like our new mission statement, sometimes I feel it just needs to be only 2 stops from Bond Street to try to encourage people to come out to Pitzhanger and not to view it as something that's very difficult to get to. But of course, for Sohn, it represented a kind of oasis that was somewhere outside of London. It took him between 3 and 4 hours to walk there from his central London base, and he did have various London points in his life at Chelsea, and then of course in Lincoln's Inn Fields. But he very much enjoyed that walk out to Ealing. He did do it by carriage as well. So he clearly sought a kind of country house sanctuary. When he went out to Pitshanger, he would sometimes do it in a day, walk out, spend some time there, and walk back in the evenings. But of course, he and his wife, because by the time he had taken on Pitshanger, he was married and he had children as well. He viewed it as a family base, and they would spend time there in the summers. They would entertain there very kind of lavishly. The art world would come out, sometimes up to 200 people at Pitshanger. And he had really kind of reshaped the manor that had pre-existed there. Interestingly, this is a different view of the manor, and that darker wing that you can see was the only part of the building that Sohn bought that he actually kept. And I think the reason he kept it was probably partly a kind of personal allegiance to the architect of that part of the house, who was George Dance, who had taken the 15-year-old Sohn on as an architect's apprentice. Sohn was from really humble beginnings. He was a bricklayer's son. He'd worked as a hod carrier for one of his brothers, and he'd then in his teens been apprenticed into an architect's firm. So we have a real interesting arc here of a story of someone who really rises beyond his origins, something much obviously more challenging in the early 19th century. But I think he probably had all sorts of kind of emotional connections really to that design by Dance and to this individual who'd given him such a start on his journey into the profession of being an architect. Dance, who was closely associated at the Royal Academy, had encouraged Sohn to study there, which he did, a free education. Back in that time, they did also teach architecture as well as art, which now they don't. And he really, his journey through that point, until the point where he acquires Pitshanger in 1800, is filled with gold medals that he wins at the RA School, 1776. This enables him to go on a grand tour, 1778 to 80. Comes back from that, begins a series of domestic commissions that he's really picked up from, I suppose you'd say, rubbing shoulders on the grand tour with the sorts of individuals who might otherwise never really have been part of his world. And so he works for private homes, and then he gets increasingly more and more public commissions. So by the time he acquires Pitshanger, he's an associate of the Royal Academy. By 1802, when he's finished rebuilding that main part of the manor there, he's been elected a full Royal Academician. He then, by 1806, unseats his former kind of master, Dance, as the professor of architecture at the Royal Academy. And then there's a whole actually slightly tricky chapter at the Royal Academy. He's a bit of an awkward character, Sohn, but he is professor of architecture there. So you could say that decade where he is at Pitshanger is full of hope and aspiration, both in terms of his family. He wants his sons to take up the family business. He wants to create a dynasty of architects. And also, of course, he wants to offer this kind of hospitality to the art world of his time. Pitshanger today has another part to it over here. This would have been a sort of utility stable kind of kitchen block in Sohn's own time. When after Sohn, and we're busy looking at the moment at that period just after Sohn, which is throwing up some really interesting and kind of checkered histories for Pitshanger, more of that somewhere else. But there is a period where it belongs to a private family and it comes into Ealing Council's ownership in the early 20th century. And basically a lot of people still alive in Ealing today will remember this building as the public library. And it was council buildings, it was used as a public library. So when Pitshanger was I suppose, brought back to life, and the restoration of Pitshanger Manor and Gallery was completed in 2019. So it's really not been in its current form for very long at all. And that building was transformed and turned into a purpose-built contemporary art, purpose-built art gallery, shall we say. So we've got the manor, we've got the historic interiors, but we also have a white cube space. Importantly, I should note to you, and I'll come on to this moment when we talk about some of the challenges, this wonderful white cube space holds no museum conditions whatsoever. And anyone who borrows from museums or who holds a museum collection will know all of the strictures and stipulations about borrowing from other people. They won't lend it to you if you can't guarantee the heat, the humidity, and all those different sort of levels, which is going to be, let's face it, increasingly challenging, isn't it? Look at the weather we're having. When I'm not here, I'm responding to WhatsApps about how we're going to manage temperatures of over 30 degrees centigrade if this continues through the summer. So I think, well, I like a curatorial challenge. And from having had a checkered career in auction houses and also working with contemporary artists, I can tell you that both of those places care less about museum conditions. So that's something that helps, because you start to think, well, if we're not borrowing from museums, let's discount that then. That's not possible in this space. Who can we borrow from? Who doesn't care? What's resilient in that kind of conditions? So I think, although I'd love to say that what we curate comes out of wonderful, inspiring presentations and kind of thoughts, it absolutely does. But the other side of it really comes out of what can we afford, what can we carefully look after, what can we borrow, and how can we make it make sense for Pitshanger. So the other thing, and I suppose this is another challenge that might be more particular to Pitshanger, is that all of the stuff that used to be at Pitshanger, because Soane was an avid collector, so was his wife Eliza. In fact, it was she who purchased the modern moral subject, A Rake's Progress, by William Hogarth, bought it at Christie's in 1802. But all of that, of course, is in the Soane Museum in Lincoln's Inn Fields. So there's no point in being a poor relation of that, is there? Soane, when he left Pitshanger, and some of his illusions sort of horribly shattered, I think. His sons had absolutely no interest in continuing his business, and in fact the family itself became increasingly fractured and actually in the end quite riven. So all of this maximalist interior, and I'm sure you're all familiar with it, exists somewhere else in the same city. So it's not really very interesting, is it? We can't have lots of it back. They can't lend it, most of it, or lots of it. And actually, that's where Soane wanted it to be. That's how he envisaged Lincoln's Inn Fields. There was a period, we've got some, for example, in the room where A Rake's Progress would have hung, we have some print version of it to kind of tell that story. We borrowed those. There was a brief moment where there's one space that holds museum conditions in our North galleries, and the Rake's Progress came back in 2020 to sort of almost celebrate that idea of Pitshanger being opened again and the Soane Museum generously lent it. And the world went into lockdown. I would imagine that very few of you actually saw this at Pitshanger. And sadly, it was there for a really long time, because it was there all through lockdown. But it wasn't seen by very many people before it had to return to Lincoln's Inn Fields. So who knows, there could be something like that again. But rather what I've liked is that one strand of what we might explore can look at other ways to interpret either the contents of what were once at Pitshanger. So this was one of the most successful exhibitions in the last 5 years. And it was, some of you will know it, Grayson Perry's series, I think 6 big tapestries in total, telling that same kind of modern moral subject. The vanity of small differences, the rise of a working class boy through his middle class era, very much denoted here in this 4th episode, which is called The Annunciation of the Virgin Deal. I'm sure you might have seen the Grayson Perry TV series, but all of the little details in this that so like Hogarth helped position this family as who they are, the type of, I think, Birkenstocks on the ground and allotment produce from their allotment, and the type of Le Creuset and the coffee pot on the stove. It's sort of eerily, acutely observed in the same way that Hogarth was able to do that in the mid-18th century. So Grayson Perry's tapestries were happy in that big gallery. Lots of people were happy to see them, but it did have a nice connection to something that felt like a connection to a story that Soane and Eliza would have enjoyed and would have understood in terms of the rise and fall of a particular individual. I sometimes wonder as well about that whole Rake's progress. Tom Rakewell, from very, very modest origins, then catapulted through lots of money. Was it something where Soane could feel any kind of connection? He was deeply chippy about his origins, actually, really probably not very comfortable. He certainly wouldn't have owned it back in the early 19th century, but rather actually, I think, tried to get away from it. His name was originally Soane without the E on the end, and he had that added on and things like that. And I think he was very aware of it. It's also struck me, Turner really was the contemporary artist of the time who spent most time with Soane out at Pitshanger. And Turner, of course, was also from those really quite humble origins, and the two of them used to fish in the lake out there together. I think that's a whole other chapter that we could explore in future. A show that we've got coming up this autumn of Peter Blake in the studio. We're going to be recreating Peter Blake's studio in the main gallery, and Peter is just lending us the contents of his studio. He's advanced in years now, Peter, and at the studio less and less. But he's allowing us to actually take all of the things that he draws on in that wonderful magpie decades-long career and recreating his workspace. But then, of course, he too has many of his collage works, and I show you 2 on the right-hand side there, which are both made inspired by Hogarth, one inspired by Gin Lane and the other by Marriage a la Mode, which is now in the National Gallery collections, of course. I'm going to speed up a little bit here. Just to say that, okay, there's one way of thinking where we can make a connection. But we've got to be really careful how we think about what comes into the space as well. Can we look after it? So we talked about those conditions. In the manner itself, so on the left-hand side, we can't have any fixings into the historic walls at all. So we've got to think carefully about that. How do we display works when we can't just hammer fixings into the walls? And then I think there's a very practical element for us as well. We don't get any government funding. How do we fund what it is that we want to put on? Can we work with a commercial gallery? Can we find a sponsor, someone who's interested in doing this? Can we keep an eye to what's coming up? So this was a show that in November didn't exist, and we had the gap in February. And I can tell you that is not the way I like or intend to work in the future. So that was very much a kind of initial challenge. And we decided to put on a show of contemporary ceramics with a young ceramics artist called Phoebe Collins-James. And Phoebe's work, which is so interesting in terms of the clay that is used, in terms of the forms and figures. Soane had an utter fascination with this. If we had had the time, I would have asked the Soane Museum, not for the things that are on display in Lincoln's Inn Fields, but for some of the things they have in storage. Can we have some of his old bricks? Can we have his old broken fragments of clay? Because I think he, as a bricklayer's son and as an architect, had a real passion for the material quality of things. So it's a way that we can explore that with some of that sculptural interest, and these did look wonderful in the main gallery space. And the lovely thing about ceramics as well is that they're much, much more resilient to any kind of flux in temperature. I'm going to show you probably 3 more slides, and then I'll release you. But again, to say, again, this predates me, Caro's The Inspiration of Architecture, but I think this was a really successful exhibition for Pitzhanger. You're maybe beginning to get the idea of what we do there, modern and contemporary British art for the most part, but how it might be in dialogue with Soane or the idea of Soane. And back to those who said, oh, Rebecca, thank goodness, 18th century, you'll be able to bring Soane back to Pitzhanger. Part of me thinks, well, yeah, but Soane was radically contemporary. His house was full of radically contemporary artists. All art was once contemporary. So in fact, that's not so foreign to John Soane at all. It's the sort of thing that he liked, shaking it up, making changes, putting it out there in a different way for people to think about. And this was Anthony Caro, actually sort of late phase in his career, really. I think he called it sculpture. Non-functional forms that incorporate architectural features to really look at the ideas around the sort of spatial memory and the feeling of architecture, but expressed through sculpture. One of my favourite, and here are some of the most sort of lovely light effects at Pitzhanger, but one of my favourite shows, and this was just as I started, was with Prem Sahib, who I know is part of your show as well. And Prem, this was his installation, Liquid Gold, really taking that lantern at the top of Pitzhanger and beaming out a kind of golden light into the darkening air. It looked absolutely wonderful. He grew up nearby, Prem. He grew up in Southall, and he made a couple of other works that related to his early gay experiences in the park, which have been quite interesting and certainly took a little bit of negotiation with the council in terms of where we would display them. But we have a Prem sculpture now in the front garden as well. 2 final things that I would say are kind of feeding into the curatorial vision and strategy for the future. One is that if, like me, you've spent 25 years of your career commuting into central London, broadly to Mayfair, and National Gallery, Christie's, the Royal Academy, finding yourself at Pitzhanger can be a bit of a change of pace. And very early on, I thought to myself, well, let's flip this round. Instead of sort of, where's Fortnum's? Can I make it something different? Can I say, what have I got that I've never had before? And the answer to that was a garden. And Soane was passionate about the garden. He had a kitchen garden. He wrote recipes. They cooked. They did all sorts of things connecting to the garden. And yet we'd never really told that garden story as as a dedicated way of thinking about Pitshanger. So we're doing lots more about seasonal change. We have our own bees, we make our own honey. We are offering lots more outdoor workshops for schools, which are totally sold out. We have a garden section in our shop, which is now really selling well, that kind of thing. So if it sounds commercial, yes, it is. We live or die by our revenues and whether people will come and visit us and whether they will consent to pay to come through the doors. And my final point, really, just to say that the next show that opens actually is called Garden Without Seasons. So having just said how much I'm loving the seasonal change, Claire Woods really wanted to talk actually a lot, these beautiful still life works that so kind of appeal to visitors. Actually, Claire is very concerned about the collapsing of seasons and that kind of entropic vision of glass houses and what we're doing and climate change and all of this. And with this quite dark vision behind her works, again, I was kind of like, yeah, could it just have garden in the title though? Because that's really important if you want people to come and visit something and come and see it. So we've landed on this Garden Without Seasons, and that opens at the end of July and will take over. And there's all sorts of nice references to sown as well, and absence and presence. And my final slide is just to say that I think any museum director today, you can puristly look at Soane and say that you want to make all of these connections to Sir John Soane, but really for about 80 to 90% of your visiting public, they'll never have heard of him. And if they have, they won't particularly care. And I think if you are not also thinking about and attending to your local audiences and thinking what it is that people will do when they come somewhere, and it might be Soanian for them to have an inspiring, creative, cultural experience, but you don't have to sort of bludgeon it out always in the terms of Soane. One of our most exciting and I think most interesting ways of thinking about the future is to think about the incredibly well-established South Asian community that surrounds Pitshanger, one of the UK's largest thriving communities there, and to think about how we can combine artists living and working in Britain with the idea of Soane, with the idea of heritage, and in a way that makes it a place to come and visit, and not just to say, tick, I've done Pitshanger, I'm not coming back, but to say, what's Pitshanger got on this season, and what can I see, and how will the manor look different because of what's programmed there. So we've got a whole South Asian strand ahead as well. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone. Apologies for missing the morning. I was entangled with assessments, which is what we tend to have to deal with this time of the year. Just maybe a little note that I come from an art school setting, and perhaps the tone of the presentation might not necessarily be hardcore academic, but hopefully that's fine with the audience in the room. Can perhaps get an understanding of who are the historians in the room? Perhaps any historians? Some in the making, perhaps? Okay, curators, art practitioners or artists, brilliant, designers, students, right? What did I miss? Architects, the architects in the room? Wow, that's a first. All right, so hopefully I won't take too much time, but perhaps I wanted, through this presentation, to foreground the queer reading of Strawberry Hill House. Perhaps some of you are already aware of that discourse, but hopefully talking through relevant projects of mine, you might get a bit more of an insight to what that means and how perhaps we can think of historic sites such as Strawberry Hill from different lenses, being perhaps a queer lens being one, as a way to transform outdated institutions and practices. I'm Cleanthis. A little bit about me. My background is in architecture indeed. I teach architecture, but also consider myself to be a multidisciplinary artist, but also a researcher. I worked in multiple contexts when it comes to art. I developed some community workshops in the Caribbean, as you can see over here. I developed a series of sculptures and monuments, mainly focusing on the loss of LGBTQ plus spaces here in London. I also have a drag alter ego. She's called Divine the Third. As you can see here, she's terrible at makeup, but it's all about the props. I guess I try to utilize my architectural training in terms of the making of certain elements, such as a protest dress or a high heel slide, and so on. But also part of my work lays in realms of speculative architecture, as you can see at the top. So that's a project that I want to be touched upon as part of this presentation. I guess as part of my teaching at St. Joseph Martin's, I also placed an experimental studio. It's called the Queer School of Thought, and you'll understand why this is relevant to the presentation. For the Queer School of Thought, we ask students to engage with queer theories, often unseen in the profession of architecture and in architectural pedagogy at large. So what that allows students is to kind of be free from the constraints of convention. What does it mean to kind of improvise with making, not think before acting, inhabit personas, but also the way that we interact with archives, for example. How would that change if it's done through a queer perspective? So a lot of the things that we're dealing with the queer school, and I guess in my own practice, is the notion of queer space. So perhaps some of you are aware, but queer space is a relatively new subject within the academic discourse, and emerged really in the 1990s. So following the Stonewall Uprising, the decriminalization of homosexuality in the UK, and the subsequent AIDS epidemic, the other citizen, the queer citizen, was high on the agenda. So the first exhibition that put queer space into, in a way, gave it a bit of visibility and a presence was the 1994 Queer Space exhibition led by notable architectural historian Beatrice Colomina. And it was a truly groundbreaking exhibition. It has never been done before or brought to the fore in that way. The exhibition itself raised significant questions regarding sexuality and space at a time when homosexuality was still a taboo. And the exhibition's manifesto claimed that queer space sought to uncover those various definitions of the terms queer and space and the conceptual bonds that unite them. Of course, the debate is still ongoing. I myself read multiple accounts from different theorists and practitioners trying to understand what does it mean when we talk about queer space. You know, is it about the inhabitation? Is it about certain aesthetics? Is it about atmosphere? Is it about who gets to design a space that makes it queer or not? And I guess I connected with this particular thought from theorist Christopher Reid, who said, who argues whether queerness can be embodied indeed as a building or a landscape. For him, queerness is constituted not so much in space, but in the body of the queer, his, hers, or its inhabitation. So that brings us, I guess, to Strawberry Hill House. So my quest at the time, both as a student and as an academic, was to understand how queerness and sexuality manifested spatially in the past. In a way, to learn from the past, because it's not a new thing. Queers have existed since the dawn of time, basically. So I was really curious to understand how queerness was enacted and how perhaps it was concealed in order to survive, and in what ways, what mechanism existed for it to be concealed in that way. So I diverted my focus to 18th century London and looked at the history of Strawberry Hill House in Twickenham, which, as you know, is a Gothic palace, like I call it, envisioned by Horace Walpole. A queer man, question mark, is very much still contested on whether he was queer or not. A writer, socialité, antiquarian, and a really notable gossip, and the son of the United Kingdom's first Prime Minister. In my understanding, inside his secluded mansion, he created a world of his own, where he could explore his identity freely from the wandering eye. And as part of this research, I developed a almost, let's call it a comic book, in which my drag persona was arriving at Strawberry Hill. So you can see here in this illustration, that's basically me arriving by a little boat by the Thames and then encountering this neo-Gothic palace, which very much, to my surprise, when I visited it, it felt strangely domestic. It's still, the space is quite, it feels homely despite the grandeur that then you see when you arrive. But the house was not a product of one man alone, and it was developed with Horace's inner circle of male friends, between 1774 and 1777. So designers John Shute and Richard Bentley collaborated with Walpole in creating a house that essentially reintroduced Gothic as an architectural language, when Palladianism was still in fashion. I thought that was super interesting and something I'll touch upon again. So, in a way, Palladianism stemmed from Andrea Palladio, a Renaissance Italian architect who introduced certain concepts of order, and in a way, one of the most influential architects of, in the world since ever, basically. And then Georgian architecture, at the time, took a lot of tropes from Palladio. So you can see, when you look at Georgian architecture in the city, you can see the stripping of ornament. There's an order, which in a way goes against what Walpole did at the same time in Strawberry Hill. So hold on to this one. So the three of them introduced this idea of the Gothic as a language again, and proclaimed themselves the Strawberry Hill Committee, or the Committee of Taste. How come it is to call yourself a Committee of Taste? This is, you are the gatekeepers of taste. I thought that was brilliant. So inside the house, the committee created this sensory and mysterious environment, reminiscent of medieval architecture and the Gothic cathedrals that Horace himself encountered during his travels to Italy. Intricate papier-mâché ceilings, molding antique furniture, and stained glass windows, all encapsulated that character of the Neo-Gothic. And I guess a lot of it also connects with ideas of, in a way, artifice, right? So it was almost like the building is putting itself a mask, the same way that perhaps Horace was trying to conceal his identity. I thought that was really fascinating. And then as well, trying to, for example, replicate marble, through painting. That's another sort of layer. And then when you look at it from a queer lens, then you can easily make that connection. Not only dressing your space, but in a way dressing yourself. The same way that identity is not given to you on a silver plate, is very much a DIY act. You kind of put it together yourself. So Horace was so fond of his achievements that he meticulously documented every architectural detail, art and belonging inside the house, and published a book, A Description of the Villa of Mr. Horace Walpole, which offers this forensic inventory of Strawberry Hills and its curiosities. Has anyone came across it? The book itself? Really, really fascinating to understand the kind of level of detail that he went through. And what does it tell us? He was immensely proud of those achievements. And what I think it was, at the end of the day, the house was a portrait of Horace himself. It was one and the same. So, let's take a second while this is loading. Perhaps I want to touch next on this idea of the act of an architectural rebellion. So over the years, Strawberry Hill became a sort of amusement park for its patron. In one of the many letters, he referred to it as a little plaything house and the prettiest bauble you ever saw. Historian Matthew Reeve once described Strawberry Hill as a large Gothic closet to which Walpole could sometimes retire when he wished to express his true persona with intimate friends. And Timothy Mole, a contemporary biographer of Horace Walpole, claimed that his homosexuality was an abiding yet overlooked subject, in understanding his aesthetics and the development of the neo-Gothic. So one could argue whether Horace's employment of the Gothic was in fact a high-calm act of defiance against normative conventions and his complete disregard to the Palladian style that prevailed. And in this way, we can all understood the creation of Strawberry Hill House as a queer act of architectural rebellion. So this is what I was talking before. I almost found a certain power in that act of saying, quite literally, F you to the convention. No? When this man who came from immense privilege, he was obviously able to buy a large estate. But at the same time, he left his legacy behind that, one cannot dispute it, but a legacy that is often not associated with his questionable, still contested queerness. For example, has everyone in this room been to Strawberry Hill? Every single one of you, amazing. You've seen the shell bench, no? One of my favorite pieces in the house. And what fascinates me with Strawberry Hill is the mythologies, the fact that each one of us can interpret the building in many, many different ways. For example, when I came across the shell bench, I could imagine Horace and his friends posing as Venus in front of it at multiple occasions, or using it as a prop to performances. Who can tell me that's wrong? It may have happened, surely, to some extent. So I was always very interested in kind of mapping or trying to see those mythologies that perhaps existed. And then part of the comic book again, understanding the house itself as a shelter, as a protective space for Horace and his sexuality. And then here, a very direct, comparison between the Strawberry Hill House and then Sir Robert Walpole's house, the Houghton Hall, Horace's father, there on the right of the screen. So you can see built again around this similar time. Obviously, Strawberry Hill grew from a smaller building that then he transformed, right? But then you can see the Palladian style that is it prevails in Houghton Hall, the order, the geometry, the definition of spaces. And then you can see the playful peculiarity that exists within Strawberry Hill. So again, it's almost like if it's in front of your eyes, you can see that. And it's quite, for me, it was a true inspiration. And something that perhaps I could take as a metaphor for a contemporary application, this idea of queer architectural rebellion. What would that mean today, in a way? And something that perhaps can go beyond aesthetics as well. So, the relevance of this idea of the queer architectural rebellion, I think is not any less relevant today, in fact, especially where we encounter the replacement of our collective spaces with towering glass architecture. As it stands today, I believe that the city does not represent the majority that inhabits it, but the interests of their wealthy few. For years, for example, the abundance of LGBTQ venues, of empty spaces in London city centre provided a platform for queer venues to emerge. But ownership was temporary, as urban space has been primarily driven by capital and not communities. Soho, for instance, the city's primary neighborhood, has been reduced to a lineup of luxury sneaker shops and so on. I'm sure you've been, I'm sure you know. And there's an ongoing sort of list of closures in the city. So when Horace Walpole was alive, effeminate men were ridiculed in theatrical plays, they were executed in public for indecent behavior. And although coming from that place of privilege, again, immense power and wealth, Horace could not change the society he was living in. So in my eyes, he ventured into the next best thing. He used his wealth to build that safe space for himself and his adopted queer family of designers, architects, historians, antiquarians, and so on. Nowadays, it's safe to say that we don't necessarily need gated estates to shield our identities, but we still need spaces to perform those identities and share our otherness with each other. And I guess this question still comes up in my head all the time. How would Horace Walpole transform Strawberry Hill House if he was here with us today? And just to close up, I want to refer to two specific projects that perhaps materialize those ideas of reimagining Strawberry Hill House, or accepting and celebrating the queer connotations of its creator and the queer past, perhaps, of Strawberry Hill. This was my thesis project when studying my master's in architecture. It was called the House of Extravaganza. Surprisingly enough, it was nominated for RBA's President Medals, which I never thought a project that deals with queerness or that trying to subvert a historic house might be considered as legitimate. But somehow it got it. And of all the images in the project, they choose to use the one from my drag persona, focusing on my hairy chest. Terrible, but it's there, accessible, not just by myself, but by my students and the general public. But that's fine, that's totally fine. So, in this speculative project, I try to insert a new potential future for Strawberry Hill House. And you can see here in the drawings that will load hopefully within seconds. I try to reimagine the vast estate of Strawberry Hill as some sort of activator for a new queer utopia to take shape. Because I kept thinking, at the time, Horace could not change that society. It was impossible, even for a man of his privilege. So he created that almost this gated house. But what if the space, the estate and the house is given back to the queer community to some extent? And the possibility to inhabit the gardens with this set of pavilions that correspond to typologies of queer space in the city. For example, I thought of a drag performance space, of a bathhouse, of a queer archive, of an enchanted garden, all taking over the estate and reactivating, becoming far less passive or as an edifice of the past. And again, you can see here some snippets from the drawings that I made to kind of represent this narrative, this new narrative for Strawberry Hill. And again, I try to explore this idea of making as well, this productivity that came from creating a set of little models or sculptures, again, as a testament to the interior of Strawberry Hill, the idea of craftsmanship, but through artifice, in a way. And as part of this project, I've also worked on different scales. Again, I didn't see myself, even as a student, as someone who just, I guess, go down a typical route in architecture and be in practice and be in office. I could not handle it more than a couple of years. So even as a student, I tried to kind of push the boundaries. I started making these like large scale sculptures. And this one is called the Monument to Strawberry Hill. And it pays homage to these queer mythologies that I was talking about. And also questions this idea of Strawberry Hill being this cultural edifice of the past, stripped from this narrative. So what I did with this sculpture, I tried to queer some of Strawberry Hill's Gothic elements and revive its memory as a safe space for gender ambiguity. So you can see at the top, scaled down cast of this facade, embellished with glitter and feathers. Essentially, I used every leftover from my drag closet. At the time, I was pouring glitter into plaster of Paris casts, and you name it. I don't even know what exactly it is in those casts, but definitely a lot of glitter. And also, you can see here the traditional Gothic colonnade, the four-pillar colonnade, is reimagined as a twisted version. Again, subversing this idea of Gothic tropes, and also in a way symbolically representing queer bodies coming together. At the top, you also have a set of windows that I use a particular technique of printing almost kind of like an opaque color. You cannot see it in the picture here because it's really dark. But again, trying to emulate the idea of the gloom that Horace, in a way, invented, in a way. And as part of Pride in 2021, I was asked to display this monument into the grounds of Strawberry Hill, which, as you can imagine, as a fresh graduate, just following COVID, that was a fantastic news. And I could not necessarily understand why they took that step, because to invite a practitioner whose work is all about questioning a narrative that is not supported by that estate, was for me was kind of like a gesture, not like a serious gesture. So I was really, really excited in this opportunity that perhaps the trust is ready to embrace those histories, no? More often than not, I guess those opportunities come during Pride. I was not surprised that this call came during Pride, it's fine. But it would be also nice to maybe think of a long-term strategy for visibility or a long-term sort of engagement with, you know, the queer histories of the house. And again, here you can see some snippets from the display. I just love how this purple light sort of comes out of the round room. It's almost like this ghostly presence of Horace, which I'm sure the artists involved in the exhibition were also kind of encountering. I mean, I felt it myself when I was walking around the house, this sort of presence. And I almost felt a very bubbly presence, and I'm pretty sure that was Horace. And the reason why I chose the round room is because it used to house these beautiful, stunning Baroque paintings that, and then at least at the time, it was still empty. So I thought to choose a particular room to kind of highlight it again as a particular place in the house that promotes, you know, the art of today. And I think that's what you have been doing with your exhibition. I think that's absolutely brilliant. And again, a little close-up of those casts. Again, every single sheet was created using laser-cut acrylic. So I had to kind of make it. It was not 3D printed or anything like that. It was all quite hands-on. A very laborious process. Keep repeating those casts. But again, I felt sort of connected to this act of creating a new form of Gothic language myself while doing it. And of course, I had to take my persona down to Strawberry Hill. And the trust also hired a photographer at the time. So I took some fabulous images for my persona with probably the best background in London, one can find in London. And that will be the kind of closure to my presentation. Thank you.
Hi everyone, you can hear me at the back. Good, great. So I am going to do a slightly insane accelerated movement from Walpole's house all the way up to the present day in about 15 minutes. That's what I'm intending to do. And fortunately, I think all of the talks so far kind of cover quite a lot of the initial kind of part that I wanted to talk about. But particularly, I think the thing that I'm going to emphasize, I was taking the idea of paper castles as something that means intertextuality. So this idea that, you know, Walpole is citing all the time, quoting from random strange places and throwing them together. And that's kind of what the Gothic tradition does as well in literature and in film, is that it's citational, it's intertextual. So I think we can take a certain kind of thematic that comes out of Walpole and track it all the way through to the present day. What I mean by that is the element that we haven't talked about, but that Gothic scholars in literature always get very excited about, which is this letter that he admits shows that the whole idea for the Castle of Otranto, the novel, came out of a dream that he had in the house. Shall I even confess to you what was the origin of this romance? I waked one morning in the beginning of last June from a dream of which all I could recover was that I had thought myself in an ancient castle, a very natural dream for a head filled like mine with Gothic story, and that on the uppermost banister of a great staircase, I saw a gigantic hand in armour. In the evening, I sat down and began to write without knowing in the least what I had intended to relate. And so, obviously, the centrepiece of his house is the staircase, and we've explored all of that amazing light and dark effects that's produced in that space. And clearly, it had a major effect on his Gothic writing. I think the other thing that Gothic scholarship has done a lot of is to talk about why he might be having a nightmare at that particular moment. And this is when he's retreated from London public life because he's just been accused, in my favourite accusation ever, of being a hermaphroditic horse in Parliament, which is effectively kind of announcing in public a kind of death sentence. You're kind of saying that I'm accusing you of being a sodomite. So it's kind of moving back from kind of London public life into this Gothic space and having a nightmare and a place to kind of start his famous Gothic story from. So the whole thing about anonymity of the first edition and then confessing the authorship in the second edition, that's the whole of that element of the anxiety kind of around that is really important. I think the other thing to pick out is that the house itself is a lovely small bauble, as he says, and it does have a kind of corridor of gloom in the middle, but it's quite navigable. But the thing I think that dreams do is turn those navigable spaces into completely bizarre, labyrinthine kind of constructions. And that's precisely, I think, the element that Gothic writers then pick up on to follow. So and I was really pleased that people were talking about the setting of the house as well, the garden being very important, and actually him talking about the prospect all the time. Because there is a contrast in early Gothic, James will be an expert on this as well, of a kind of ordered house and a disordered space beyond the house, usually a kind of forest or wilderness. And that kind of is constantly happening in the Castle of Otranto, but particularly in kind of descriptions like this. The labyrinth is not necessarily in the house, but is around the house and masking the house. So when Isabella escapes in the novel, you can see that it's described the whole space around it in the forest area nearby. This is how Theodore explores it, at length determined to repair to the forest that Matilda had pointed out to him. Arriving there, he sought the gloomiest shades as best suited to the pleasing melancholy that reigned in his mind. In this mood, he roved insensibly to the caves, which were now reported round the country to be haunted by evil spirits. And being of a brave and adventurous disposition, he willingly indulged his curiosity in exploring the secret recesses of this labyrinth. So there's an element of making the labyrinth outside the house, and what the Gothic starts to do is incorporate that into houses as the genre develops. If we go to someone like Anne Radcliffe and The Romance of the Forest, with that fantastic cover by Broadview, there is again this sense of a house and in a space that is itself kind of labyrinthine. And I don't need to read that out, I don't think. So that last bit, here was a wild and extensive forest to perplex with its labyrinths those who might attempt pursuit. So they're kind of hiding out in this mouldering castle inside a labyrinth itself. And then the house starts to become a labyrinth on its own. And that gets more and more elaborate as we go to something like Anne Radcliffe's Mysteries of Udolpho, 1794. That's the book that really did supercharge the Gothic as a genre, became a huge sensation, and produced its monstrous other 2 years later in Matthew Lewis's The Monk. That was the book, incidentally, that basically stopped Anne Radcliffe from publishing any more in her lifetime, because she was so horrified at kind of what had been produced by her attempt to kind of explore an explained supernatural, a Gothic that was indulging all of these wild emotions and sensations, but wanting to contain them. But suddenly you have its kind of opposite that's emerging in this amazing licentious kind of text. The other thing about that now is that Gothic novels are starting to become themselves incredibly labyrinthine and overwhelming in terms of their plots and interpolated stories, plots within plots, sudden random shifts of perspective. In other words, more and more oniric, more and more dreamlike in their approach, getting weirder and weirder. Let me jump 100 years, and I'm going to talk about the house then that might have started somewhere in Strawberry Hill, but is now in the centre of London. That's what the Gothic does. It moves from the edges of Europe, set in Italy, France, or Spain, moves progressively into the centre. And the most famous late Victorian novella of this kind, which also famously came from a dream, is Stevenson's Jekyll and Hyde. And there has been some speculations, let's say, about what house it might have been based on. Personally, I think he's looking at Manchester Square, and those grand houses where all the doctors live, and their strange mews houses behind them, which were the servants' entry and for stabling and so on. But the house in the book makes absolutely no sense. It's completely kind of deranged and disordered as a space. And there has been some claim that Dr. John Hunter, as of the Hunterian Museum, had a house in Leicester Square, no less, that he then built into the next street so that he could kind of develop a museum and a demonstration space and so on for his medical collections. So is this a kind of version of Jekyll's house that also houses this kind of alternative self? And I've just put up Sargent's famous, really puzzling, enigmatic portrait of Robert Louis Stevenson and his wife in the corner there, Fanny, almost draped and almost invisible, and that strange, enigmatic perspective in between them, the kind of space that opens between them. It's a very queer portrait, if you like, and very sharp about Stevenson's identity, I think. So we're starting to get these kind of dream spaces that seem to occupy the kind of present city, but that are starting to kind of become Gothic and dreamlike in their own sort of way. And I'm going to make a kind of sequence of connections. So this is a direct link between texts. So in the late 1890s, the Society for Psychical Research had a haunted house committee. So they investigated actual haunted houses by staying in them with psychic sensitives who would try and pick up all these kind of details. And there was a huge kind of eruption around a publication called The Alleged Haunting of B House. That was Ballashin House in Scotland. And it was occupied by a psychic sensitive called Miss X, Ada Goodrich Freer, a psychic sensitive and pathological liar, who kind of gave this description of the haunted experiences around that. It came out in 1898, the same year as Henry James's Turn of the Screw, which, as you might know, is a kind of set in a country house. The governess alone starting, is she a psychic sensitive who starts to see two very menacing spectres who seem to be after the children she's supposed to be looking after? Or is she herself projecting this and externalizing her kind of fears and desires? And it's a place where house and psyche come together absolutely. They are married in a way that is suggested by Walpole, indicated perhaps a little bit by Jekyll and Hyde, but is fully now a psychical kind of space in all the meanings of that term. Those books then start to kind of influence Henry James's later text. This is completely bizarre, incomprehensible, wonderful text where a man haunts himself in his own house and seems to be chasing after his own double, who is a monstrous version of himself. And just the kind of suggestions of the covers, I think, are always really interesting. It's an amazing dream kind of narrative space, really. And one of the most famous mid-century versions of this was Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House, which has a direct inspiration from The Alleged Haunting of Balashyn House. So she read that, found that book and explored that idea partly through Henry James to think about houses as psychic generators, that if you are yourself sensitive, you produce a kind of weird feedback effect where the house starts to get more and more haunted, more and more dreamlike and trapping you in spaces that you can't escape from. And that's a very kind of famous version of, she wrote in a preface saying that she'd read The Alleged Haunting of Balashyn House, and it kind of came up with this. The other person who read that whole sequence, of course, was Stephen King for The Shining, which is just a version of that kind of whole narrative, which itself is obsessed with labyrinths and labyrinthine kind of structures. And Kubrick is the figure who really brings that out. That film is full of images of the Minotaur in the labyrinth. There's the Minotaur, Jack Nicholson, down there, about to enter the labyrinth and be fooled by Theseus, his son, Danny. And all of the kind of work that's done around the strange corridors of the hotel, which make no sense, where the carpet keeps switching in its orientation, just to make you feel this kind of labyrinthine, disorienting kind of space. So there's a whole kind of chain here that we might explore. And that begins to, has anyone read House of Leaves? This is perhaps the most influential Gothic novel it came out in 1999, I think, which is an extraordinary story, typographically as well. It's full of typographical play. It's about 750 pages long, and it's about a small, tiny house in which they discover an opening which leads to virtually infinite corridor space, but it's entirely empty. And nothing can kind of survive or cope with that. They even they get bikes and try and cycle all the way through this. They keep going for 70 miles and it's still not finished. All in this kind of tiny house. If it sounds familiar, that's because that has been very influential, I think, on how people think about Gothic film space and twisted, oniric kind of labyrinths as well. So you get that a lot in gameplay. And also with figures like Guillermo del Toro, who, I don't know if you're involved in the PT Obsession, which is the playable teaser, which was a 2014, I think, 5-minute teaser for a new video game, which is just one corridor, and that's it. And it never got made, and people are obsessed with this one tiny corridor that looks entirely like, to me, the Walpole corridor, and it's got all of these kind of spaces that you, of course, can never investigate because the game was never made, but it's sitting there on YouTube for you to explore. Most recently, I think, that came out was a Japanese film called Exit 8, which is just simply being stuck in a loop of an underground station where you keep going round and round and round. You have to notice things that are changing each time you pass through this loop, otherwise you die. And that kind of sense of developing a kind of loop kind of mentality through a labyrinth has been a kind of very influential thing. So that is, it had a brief release last month. It's about to stream, I think, in a matter of days, but it's been totally eclipsed by the back rooms. This film that came out May 29th is when it came out, made by a 20-year-old, appalling, and you know, from his previous YouTube work, a tiny budget that has absolutely totally smashed open the box office around the world. And it's about this kind of, you're walking through into a space which is infinite and sulphurous yellow, perhaps an echo of the Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, another Gothic novel from the late 19th century. And is a really kind of powerful understanding of kind of labyrinthine spaces and how you might get, that might become a metaphor for self or psyche, which is what's sort of suggested at the end of the film, that you are stuck inside an MRI machine and you are investigating your own kind of brain and its roots through, if you take that explanation of the film. Yeah, if you want more of this, I did a illustrated history of the Gothic, which actually starts with a chapter on the house, and the first section is called Two Queer Houses. So that would be Strawberry Hill, but also the one that no longer sadly exists, Fonthill Abbey, which was the other, grand queer house that I think it's really helpful to think alongside Strawberry Hill with. And Corridors has a whole chapter on the Gothic and the role of the corridor in Gothic space, so you can pursue those if you want. But thanks for your time.
So, I'll just give you a little context here. The poem responds to Paper Castle, and also the house, Strawberry Hill House. That
Could you speak up, please?
Yeah, I can't hear you.
Sorry. And it borrows some of its wording from the titles of the installations, paintings and sculptural works by the artists involved in the exhibition. So, again. Architects, After Paper Castles and Selected Letters by Horace Walpole. I wish to write, and please remember, as my friend, myself, the sender, you belong, a circle member of secrets here and so much more to tell you. I know exactly nothing and pray only of blossoming great blessings on your gracious self from our loving, blessed Mary Saint, adoring and adore no bad angel and offend no good one. Remember fruit and thy protectress I ask for, our strawberry fortress, treasured forevermore. So once upon a sunlit splendor, while the strawberry sky so tender did not rain a drop to cool the tip down of any green past hill house door, while I worked away inside improving aspects of the South Sea tide, producing numbers on my mathematician's ruler, moving Twickenham earth and fire, and so much more, inside the hallowed walls of Straw Castle, locked up behind my measured door, compiling figures and not much more. For months the sky would not surrender a drop of dew or whisper of tender rain to quench the strawberries off Fruit Hill, or any green past hill house door, but on my walk with mathematicians ruling, faithfully inside my pocket cooling, from the constant heat of my hand fooling, the impressive mind and seeking to manual blot out the very sun and more, the representatives of moon and stars came to my very door. And so it goes, the ghost objects in glowing form floated first cross roads to perform, accompanied by brazen trumpet, which made me shake with great violence, for at cross deep the ghosts were skimming, at the barrens I heard them singing, on Marble Hill the lights were dimming, with fear of great usurp and ravish and great threat, and yet these spirits' altar was much more than disturbed suspects of villain more. And so I ran down Tower Road so dreary, and I ran till weak and weary, but the spirits tripped the light fantastic, as graceless I approached Hill House door. Over Vale the ghosts were skimming, on the Thames I heard them singing, on Strawberry Hill the lights were dimming, as my hand felt the handle of the heavy door. The ghosts were blowing gently at the cardboard castle, imploring and requested me to speak for them, and there was this, and so much more. And so it goes, the ghost objects in angelic form, for as they gathered hence to perform, and I feared the fear of some infernal symmetry, for in me the mathematician deduced some a priori de facto, and yet this fallacy was no match for
a prima facie sight before saw eyes trying to debate the honoured virtue of these flying heaven's angels into session while communing many moments for my magnificat concession or confession that they were truly just so much more. So, with a count for formal theory, I'll describe their ghostly fairy presence theory. Their wings were made of fabric, metal rails, of silver mesh and lime and glass and more. Their neon wings were whitening and copper painted brightening, their oils on canvas tightening with cravat and clay and again and much more. They made my paper castle new, unknown to no name and more, and held the many keys to Hill House door. And goes to Ice Angel, a second skin, Solange Angel, do not preach the sterile and begin with what heaven's bright candles wore, sable plumes and long white dresses, their wings dusted with otherworldly iridescence, glowing thickly as one whispers and blesses the thicket of sweet blossom hanging over the door. And with great crack that heavens broke and rained down with a sudden thunderous roar, drenching us fairy ghosts hovering above the very floor, and here was this which cannot be destroyed and more. My friend, I left them open just for you, they said, of the heavens opens ready gate, they promised said, and I too, to tell this tale and more, of paper castles, obsidian, mirror, mesh, and making of magic more breathtaking. Make paper miracles, said these angels requesting, for we should live 1,000 lives or more. Yonder window breaks for Zeno and the paradox of law. Make this Gothic fairy castle tale anew forevermore.
Hi everyone, welcome to the final session. This is our panel where we hope to bring out the creative voices and responses and reflect on the day. The panel is going to be moderated by Freddie, the co-curator, one of the co-curators of Paper Castle, who has been a crucial member of the team as an artist liaison, with our final guest, Anna-Marie Kisra. Anna-Marie is an artist who's not only just featured in our exhibition, but undertook a special commission for us, the paper recreation of the famous Gibbon's cravat, which once belonged to Walpole and now resides in the V&A. And we have just learned, I hope this is breaking news, that I'm delighted to announce that the cravat replica will be on display at Strawberry Hill for longer than our exhibition run, which closes on the 21st of this month. And it'll be on for another couple months yet. I'm very much looking forward to hearing all of Freddie's questions. And after the panel, I hope you'll all join us for a drink down the hall. Okay, take it away.
Okay, thank you so much, Sophie. And I think we can all agree it's been a fantastic day of unexpected encounters and exploring things such as the uncanny, the strange, the Gothic, obviously, but really through all these different lenses. But as everyone knows here, Paper Castle was conceived as an exhibition that really challenges the heritage property, the heritage house, and integrates contemporary artwork into the fabric of the heritage house. So it's really thinking about what does that mean, what are the challenges, what are the opportunities there, and who better to ask than artists who worked and exhibited in Strawberry Hill in very recent years. So we've got Anna-Marie and Cleanthus joining me. And firstly, I think I'd like to start with you, Anna-Marie, and actually, Diego, could we just go to the other side? So for anyone who hasn't seen her work, this is her work here. But could you just please tell us what we're looking at and a bit about what you do.
Okay, I mean, I've been looking at this close up for like the last month and a half. You probably are able to tell much more about the actual origin of the real version. But the original, and after I've heard your talk, I'm like mind blown because now I think I've realized something, which is that the original was a wooden cravat carving, and I'm like, Hundy P, has that been worn as like a drag outfit? Because he's worn it, or so you guys have told me, which 100% would have been as a sort of like subtle nudge of like, this is an unusual piece that I'm wearing. Fashion. Anyway, so I made a paper craft version, which is a as close to possible true replica of the wood carving out of lots of tiny layers of paper.
And I mean, it's really beautiful because you can see in the close-up how closely you've kind of copied all the details. Can you tell us a bit more about like how did you do it? What kind of techniques did you use? And more broadly, like what you do in your practice?
Sure. You guys came to my studio and I think I was about halfway where I realized that the design is completely organic because it's a hand it's not based on a real lace piece, it's based on a wood carving of a lace piece. So this is a recreation that is paper pretending to be wood, pretending to be lace. So my brain just went like 300 degrees. So I started off with photos of the wood carving from the V&A from all the different angles, and I think they also had a 3D rendering, which was really helpful to see all the details and be able to zoom in. So on Adobe Illustrator, I designed all the individual elements that make up the lace. So there's clover petals, there's circles, there's rims, there's lots of different sort of punctured details. And after having designed all that, I realized that when I got to about halfway, I was like, oh, I could be really cheeky and then just copy, paste and flip and do the mirror side and then have a perfectly symmetrical piece, but that's not true to the original. So I still ended up painstakingly designing the other half as well. And then every single, this is really difficult to explain without visuals, but every single piece is a piece of paper that's been stacked with another piece of paper to get volume. So each element might exist of 7 layers of paper that have then been hand cut and scored and punctured with a needle to create all the sort of small holes. And what's really fascinating by creating it in this way is that because the original is a wood carving, not a lace piece, if the original was a lace piece, I would have made it in a very different way, because then I could have I mean, if anyone sews here, you can sort of interpret how I might have approached it, and then you would have known that it was a full sheet of fabric that then when you pick it up, crumples and folds. But because it wasn't that, it's a wood carving. So whenever you go into the fold, you would see that the pattern wouldn't continue and it would stop and you'd have to stick a new piece on. So instead, I very much had to make it in segments. And the wood carving would originally have been a solid block where you carve away excess until a fine detailed piece remains, whereas I'm doing it the opposite, where I build from nothing paper layers upward to create volume and give it shape. I hope that sort of explains the logic as to how I've made it, but basically many, many hours of painstakingly cutting things and then gluing it and then hoping it doesn't fall apart.
Thank you. That's like, yeah, mind-blowing to listen to you and like how much detail you went to for every single piece. I think you told us there were like 650 individual pieces of paper. Is that right?
We have it in the behind-the-scenes video. I think the amount of cuts is like 1,200 something, not including all the hand embellishments I did on top of that. So yeah, a lot.
Crazy. But what you said just then about like building something up was really interesting, because Cleanthus, I think that also applies to what you did, and in your work, which was the monument to Strawberry Hill, you talked about building it up from layers of plywood, for example. And I just wonder whether that's like something that's, I don't know, it feels like something that resonates a lot with the house, and this idea of layering and this idea of texture and kind of building something from disparate parts that we've talked about today. But yeah, I mean, I guess, could you tell us a bit more about your experience of working in Strawberry Hill and this experience of like using the house as an inspiration for your work?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that, I mean, I covered quite a bit even during my talk, so apologies in advance. But I
Yeah.
think maybe, according to you, and I absolutely love your piece. I think when Frederick showed me, I was kind of taken away by it. Obviously, because we as architects are trained to use paper to imagine the worlds that we design that is impossible to kind of build in one-to-one. So it's a material that we're very accustomed to. But like looking at this kind of fine detail and perhaps this idea of, the whole exhibition, Paper Castle, connecting, and perhaps, I'm not sure if you made that connection in your own conceptual curatorial framework of this idea of paper architecture, which is the idea of, architects such as Zaha Hadid or Cedric Price in their formative years were considered paper architects, meaning their designs will never be built, not because they were so impossible to kind of comprehend. So I really love this kind of metaphor that then Horace ended up creating, really, this kind of paper monument to himself for real. But perhaps going back to my own artwork, I think contrary to you, I was absolutely not commissioned to produce this artwork. I only did it as part of my concept development, as part of my own process into trying to connect with the histories of Strawberry Hill. But I never ever thought it will eventually be presented, within the house itself. So I would have perhaps done things differently if I know like one day it will be able to inhabit one of Horace's rooms. But for me, it was a lot of, I think, trial and error at the time. I was really getting interested into like plaster or manipulating plaster or working with this idea of artifice and embellishing things, and this idea of ornament.
Did you
And
add
then-
any gold leaf?
No, I wanted to though, at some point, like some silvery gold leaf or something. But yeah, so I started sort of experimenting, and then I was always giggling when I was using sort of glitter in this work, because I guess Horace was less perhaps interested in kind of shininess, more of this gloom. But then you see this beautiful papier-mâché ceiling, and it's still embellished in that way. And then, when you visit Strawberry Hill on a very sunny day, then the light that you get from certain rooms is unbelievable. So I thought it was really interesting that this monument perhaps at times lives within this world of darkness, of gloom, but also the idea of shininess that comes through. And the way that I put it together is, layers of these kind of plywood boxes that when they come together, they create almost like a closet. And then in the back, I place Horace's head on a stick, again, symbolically, because of, it was this idea that if he was queer out in public, probably he would have ended up being executed, despite his status. But then his head was carefully sort of enclosed behind this towering monument, this enclosure.
Do you still have it?
I still have it. I'm not getting rid of it yet, but the
Because
more
the inside
work-
looks like a doll's house, like you can like play from behind.
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of things that, perhaps I could do. But yeah, this idea that half of it was also not cladded in those, queered columns, because I wanted to see this kind of bodies moving in and around it. So in a way, it masked parts of it or concealed parts of it, but still, it's almost like permeable, much like the house. As much as Horace tried to conceal himself, here we are, so many years later, really trying to out him, time and time again. So,
Do you think that he would have wanted that? What do you think his kind of response would be to these interpretations today, or these interventions?
I think he would love the attention. I mean, I'm sure most of you know as well, he used to love showing off his house to many, not only his friends and his extended network, but beyond that. Once I've seen this kind of ticket he used to kind of put out to visitors to his estate, so he took great pride in showing off his achievements, both in spatial terms, but also the objects he acquired. He was a man of taste, but he also believed, I guess, in kind of sharing that wealth somehow. I think famously he avoided having children in the house. Is that correct?
Makes sense.
I'm sure he has his reasons, but yeah, absolutely, he would have loved this idea of the attention that it gets, and maybe reimagining that legacy of what it can be. And I think that's a brilliant take too, because essentially, when I was commissioned, only New Strawberry Hill was having certain events such as a flower show, or obviously the Gothic Festival here and there, but I'm not sure it had an exhibition of its kind before, like the one you've been staging. So I really hope it can be this kind of, push to perhaps allowing more curators, more artists to kind of inhabit and reintroduce and reinterpret. And
I didn't know the museum, existed until you guys emailed me.
Yeah.
And they tend to
You
have
live in
that.
London as well?
Yeah, I've been
There
here
you
for
go.
14 years. But even the curators the Strawberry Hill people said, oh yeah, we tend to get that feedback. Either people love us or they don't know of us, like anyone below the age of 35.
I think that's such an important point, because a lot of these historic houses, as Rebecca Lyon was saying earlier today, they really don't have these kind of audiences spread out across generations. It's like much more centered around, older generations, and so these efforts of outreach really will be so vital for their survival in the future. Just talking about your work a bit more, Enrica, because I just have to ask you some more about it. You said to us in our studio visit that it's inhabiting two worlds. It's between two worlds, and I wonder if you could talk a bit about that and the kind of, I guess you're referring to material worlds. Is that right?
Yeah, I guess just because, I was saying earlier, the original being a wood carving, which is a whole different technique to the actual original, which is a lace. Is it bobby? I don't know what the English word for it is. The original needlepoint lace making. And as soon as I made it out of paper craft, I realized that it lives so much closer to needlepoint, not just because it's white, but because of the delicacy in how it's made. And as soon as I finished it, I was on the phone to my mum, kind of there's so much Dutch culture around needlepoint lace, the head pieces and whatever. You could do so many cool things now. I'm going to just start a whole collection of paper craft lace, which would be really, amazing to be able to research. But I guess, I don't know if you're referring to living between two worlds, mostly from a material point.
However you kind of experience that. But I think that you said that you were not sure about where it was wood, or where it was imitating wood and where it was imitating the lace. And you told us that it was closer to the lace, but there were elements of wood coming through as well, that you tried to kind of capture.
Yeah, I very much made it a solid piece because I wasn't copying the lace version.
Yeah.
So the back, you can see that it's as if it was carved out of wood, a solid, sort of as if it was the base. And yeah, you kind of see photos of it, or flip it over and see the detail. But yeah, that it's not you wouldn't be able to pick up and shake it about. Also, definitely don't do that because it cost me so much time to make. But it will just be a solid thing. The waves don't move, if that makes sense. It is a structurally sound piece. And I guess also between two worlds, paper used to be wood. It's the same material, just very thinly sliced. So it is quite fascinating that it's kind of in between. And I guess in the poet. In her poem, she mentioned ghost objects several times. I found that quite funny because the exhibition I did before this, which is I'm assuming is what led to me getting commissioned for this piece, is Leighton House, which is why I think you should go. Not because my artwork's there, but because it's really fascinating and it's really similar. And that was an exhibition which was paper craft reinterpretations of lost artifacts like furniture pieces and quite large scale pieces because they've gone missing, and so they became kind of ghostly, and that's why we went for white paper, because they're quite translucent and eerie and stuff. And it's quite funny that this piece has turned out quite similarly as a sort of homage to the wooden sculpture rather than a direct copy or trying to imitate it, because even the V&A has commissioned a recreation, like an actual, like they hired a proper wood carver specialist. There's a video of the woman doing it in her studio where she's properly trying to carve to the same beautiful standard and detail level of the original. And they had that on display for a while at Strawberry Hill, and the curator there told me as well, like it doesn't feel quite the same because you know it's a copy, and it feels a bit off, and the colour's not aged, and it looks like the thing it's trying to be. Whereas when you're making something completely new, like a paper craft such as this, you know it's not the wood and you know it's not the lace, but it's its own thing in between those two worlds. Which I guess is answering your question. Took me a while to get there.
No, it definitely did. So I think I'll ask you both one last question, which is like, just speaking from your experiences across your practices, across your career, what is it like as an artist to work with heritage institutions? Is the role of an artist today to preserve heritage? Is it to challenge heritage? Or is it something else? Who would like to take that first?
Maybe I'll have a go at this, but before that, I also, while you were talking, actually, I was thinking about this idea of the in-between, the object that you've made, and apologies, Freddie, if I'm asking a question.
Go ahead.
And not to go back to, I guess, my main interest about Strawberry Hill, but it's almost like that queer act of reimagining that object in this in-between state I find fascinating. And perhaps there's this friend of mine that I can think of who works in a similar manner, but they're not necessarily, their focus is not paper. But maybe you know them as well. Their name is Marv Summers, and they made these beautiful paper dollies. So they are supposed to be paper dollies, but they're made out of sandpaper. So I see you get this idea of like the roughness, but then the kind of intricacy of the paper dolly. And the object itself is kind of queer in that nature because it doesn't pretend to be something it's not, but it's just another reading of that object. And I find this absolutely fascinating. I'll really try and like make it to Strawberry Hill soon to check it out again. But back to your question, this idea of heritage, I guess, I'm sure I don't have the career as an artist that perhaps you have in a way, because for me it tends to be something that when it comes in and it's great and it's fantastic. I'd love to do more of it, obviously, but as an academic or working as an educator, it takes a lot of my time. But even in my teaching, I ask students to like challenge heritage. Within even the design studio, we work with heritage buildings, so we ask them to, for example, challenge listed status of buildings. And I'm still thinking about this idea of producing a brief for Strawberry Hill because of its listed status and what would it mean to kind of introduce a new version of it or reimagine it in a way. Because again, if we go back, Horace himself added and modified the house over time in multiple sorts of ways. And perhaps going back to the specifics of the question, heritage institution, in my experience, I only had another experience with V&A recently. Actually, again, I was very pleased to kind of participate in a Friday Late about queer spaces in the city. And of course, they're used to this format of opening up their spaces during, again, those times. But I think V&A is another sort of like ball game because they want to bring culture closer to a younger audience. And even if it comes from, that super established institution with links to royalty and so on, I think they do such a good job in trying to link with culture, considering the recent expansions. But I still think certain historic houses, they're still guarded by outdated ideas of preservation, and that the fear of doing something different, that fear that it might change the legacy of place. But I think, especially in cases like Strawberry Hill, when there's so much evidence of all these kind of different sort of readings of plays and the histories of plays and mythologies of plays that are overlooked, why don't we try and bring them forward? So for me, be it in the work I do as a teacher or in my own practice, I always think about these frictions that do happen when you are engaging with heritage institutions. And just to give an example of my participation at Strawberry Hill, when I first installed the monument, I had a description very kind of point blank suggesting Horace Walpole was a queer man. And then I was asked to sort of take it out. And then it really confused me because, well, the whole project was about that. And yet when it's actually up, there was this fear of just saying it, even if several historians have suggested it, even if in many of Horace's letters, you cannot deny the fact that he had romances and relationships in a way with other men at the time. But yet, while opening up, there was still just about, So I think it's, super, super interesting that after all these years, they keep pushing the envelope and maybe, there's more to come. I mean, you managed to put a neon light within Strawberry Hill. So I find that, again, fascinating, but
And Marika, I guess
Same answer, same question.
What's it like?
Okay, it's very funny you say that because on our very first Zoom call, I think you guys were listing all the reasons as to why it would be really fun for me to participate. And one of the things was obviously, and queer, but never been, anyway, very much in a way of we're throwing the word in there, but it's never been documented, proven, or whatever, so we can't actually say it on the piece of paper, but we're all thinking it. So anyway, let's just leave that between the lines. And I find that really interesting because it's surely when you then hire people that are in those spaces and in those communities during Pride Month, which is its own conversation, but I find that really interesting because the same happened with Leighton House. I think maybe Strawberry Hill, maybe it's because you guys are already a different generation and we're very much pointing it out from day one, that I was immediately aware when I walked into space. I was oh yeah, duh, look at the gold ceilings, look at this catwalk hallway, hello. But with Leighton House, I had it in a very completely opposite way, where it wasn't until all my friends walked in and every one of us was okay, bathhouse, interesting. All these paintings are of men dressed as women, but they're definitely men because they have got Adam's apples and everything's very romantic. And okay, we're noticing all of these little things that are very obvious. And then talking to the director who's, I don't know, in his 60s, 70s, and he was kind of oh, that's... Anyway, so the wine's over here, and you're okay, you don't really want to acknowledge this just quite yet. That's interesting. And I think, so for that reason, hiring artists that are related to the topics that you're discussing is really important. And also what you were saying as well, with England, I'm Dutch, so I feel similar vibes. Colonial times, where did the money come from? How is this being funded? That's always really important as well to kind of query. And as an outsider, I think I also work a lot in sort of branding, creative, film, TV, etc. And with large brands, you find this where things are no, but Tiffany blue is this exact shade, and we've always done it this way because that is the brand, and this is how it is. And in a similar way, I think with certain historical houses, it's very much no, but these are the texts, and the texts are Bible, and this is how it's been documented, and this painting was exactly there, and this is how it's always been, so we need to preserve because that's how it's been. And then as soon as you ask, but why? It's really interesting because every single person, even several times, you've also mentioned it, paper mache has been mentioned as this is what the ceiling is made out of at Strawberry Hill. And I was okay, but which bits though are paper mache? Because that's definitely plaster, and how it's connected can't be. And but you say paper mache, but which bits though? And then one of the curators said, oh, talk to Helen, who is in her 80s and who's the oldest volunteer who's been here for eons, and she knows absolutely everything about everything in this house. So I talked to her and I was okay, so paper mache, be real, come on. Paper mache? And she was well, no, at the time, it's actually rag. But at the time, that's the same wording used for paper mache. But it's not. So it's not paper. And she was like, well, no, it would have been rag, and it would have been like animal glues, and so all together with plaster. So in a theoretical sense, that is paper mache. And I was like, that's all great. But in the modern day, if you tell any of you people paper mache, every single one of you is thinking wallpaper paste with bits of newspaper, and we're slowly sticking them together. And that's purely from writing something down and word choice. Words change over time. This is becoming a whole talk in itself. But anyway, it's really fascinating. Long story short, yes, hire people who come with questioning attitudes, because you might find out, like, if not a lot of people have done really intense research into whether or not he was queer or not. You have, because you've recognized certain things, and now that might open up way more conversations. My friend who's an architect mentioned Parliament as a building, very camp and Gothic. Maybe there's some interesting stories there. Like, there's so many new ways to now explore other museums and historical institutes, and yeah.
I mean, feels like a really great place to end. Thank you.
I feel like we should carry this on in the pub.
But I think what you're saying is all about the cracks, no? And I often found myself as I think queer artist or practitioner or architect, you name it, like trying to like inhabit those cracks. And I think, you know, when an institution comes that carries that heritage and gives you an opportunity, I'm always say yes. I will never say no, because I know the ways to kind of inhabit those cracks. And like you said, even if you're not getting that stamp of approval at the end fully to the way that you wanted to, you still put your work out there and you're still trying to inhabit those cracks and affect change over time. I think that's brilliant. That's the kind of thing that we're trying to do, isn't it? So, yeah.
I mean, it's so important, and I hope that this conversation will continue into the afternoon and into the drinks. And if anyone has any more questions for any of our speakers, then feel free to ask them. And hopefully you can all join us for a short drink or a couple.